"Mom, this house isn't yours anymore. You want to stay? There's a storage room out back, but from now on, things run my way." A 65-year-old woman walks out of a Back Bay mansion at 4 a.m. carrying everything she owns in a single leather suitcase, a kitchen knife her mother gave her, a copper pot, and $1,400 sewn into the lining of her coat. Her husband didn't leave her a single line in his will. Her daughter-in-law took the house, the company, the grandchild she'd raised for 5 years. They offered her a windowless room next to the mops and buckets. She said no. She walked to an abandoned warehouse on the South Boston waterfront and started building with her own hands, using what the whole city had thrown away. But what she found buried beneath decades of concrete and rust changed everything, not just for her, but for the most ruthless mafia boss in Boston, her own son. This story's gonna hit you where it counts. If it moves you, smash that like button, share it with someone who's been through the fire, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the day Henry Aldridge died with his morning coffee still sitting on the desk, untouched and cold. Because in 45 years, Henry Aldridge never once let his coffee go cold. Henry Aldridge died on a Tuesday morning in October, seated in the leather chair in his office overlooking Boston Harbor, his hands still inside the leather gloves he had never once taken off while working, as if his heart had stopped in the middle of signing one order and he hadn't yet reached for the next. Maggie knew before anyone called, because the 6:30 coffee she had made every day for 45 years was still untouched on his office desk when she passed by at 7, and Henry Aldridge had never once in his life let his coffee go cold. She didn't cry. She placed her hand on the tabletop, stood still for a moment, then picked up the phone and called the funeral home before she called anyone else, because Maggie Aldridge was the kind of woman who finished what had to be done before she allowed herself to feel. They held the funeral at Sullivan & Sons Funeral Home in Back Bay on a Thursday afternoon. The room filled with white flowers and expensive suits, with fewer tears than people might have expected, because in Henry Aldridge's world, people didn't come to funerals to cry. They came to count who was still standing and who was gone. Maggie stood in the front row, her back straight, wearing the black dress she wore only for church and funerals, her hands clasped in front of her stomach, nodding to each person who came to offer condolences, without hearing a single word they said, because she was looking toward the back of the room, where her son stood. Tyson Aldridge, 37 years old, in a black 3-piece suit, stood leaning against the back wall, with both hands in his trouser pockets, and a face that no one in that room could read. He didn't stand at the front because he didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew he was there, and that was enough. Tyson Aldridge had run the dark side of the Aldridge Empire since he was 25, controlling everything that moved in and out of Boston Harbor, without his name appearing on a single piece of paper. And he did it with what people in the business called presence, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make the whole room fall silent without anyone knowing why. He looked at his father's coffin from the back of the room and didn't step forward. Maggie looked at her son, and what she saw wasn't grief, but a machine calculating behind those pitch-black eyes. She knew Tyson loved his father, but he loved in his own way, the kind no one saw and the kind he never let anyone see. After the funeral, Maggie went home alone, climbed the familiar staircase, walked past the master bedroom, and stopped. The deep blue velvet curtains she had bought 37 years earlier, the curtains she had chosen at the shop on Newbury Street in the year Tyson was born, were gone. In their place hung new white curtains, and draped across the headboard was Priscilla's silk nightgown, as if the room had belonged to someone else for a very long time. Maggie stood in the doorway and looked in. She said nothing. She didn't enter. She took off the tight black shoes she had worn for the past 10 years only for church and funerals, slipped on her old cloth house slippers, then went downstairs to the kitchen and set a pot of water on the stove to make dinner, because the dead had already been buried, but the living still had to eat. 3 days after the funeral, Orson Webb arrived at the mansion at 10 o'clock in the morning, a 60-year-old man with completely white hair and a leather briefcase worn smooth at the corners, stepping into the house with the face of someone who knew he was about to light the fuse of a bomb no one could catch. He sat down at the dining table, the same table where Maggie had served thousands of meals over 45 years, opened his briefcase, and began to read. The will had been written 7 years earlier, when Reed, the eldest son of Henry and Maggie, was still alive. It stated clearly that the entire estate, the Back Bay house, Aldridge Maritime, the bank accounts, the names on the business documents, everything was to be left to the eldest son and his wife. Reed had died in a settling of scores 3 years earlier. But the will had never been changed, and by the exact language of the law, Priscilla, Reed's widow, automatically became the legal heir to all the visible assets of the Aldridge empire. Henry had scheduled a meeting with Orson to draft a new will, the appointment set for Friday. But he died on Tuesday. 3 days. 3 days was the distance between Maggie having everything and having nothing. When Orson finished reading, he folded the paper, then shot a quick glance at Priscilla, a glance only Maggie noticed, the glance of two people who had already made their arrangement and were now merely acting out the rest of the scene. Maggie sat there and listened from beginning to end without moving, both hands resting on her lap, her eyes fixed on the damp stain on the wall that she had asked Henry to repaint for 3 years and that had never once been repaired. Her name didn't appear a single time. Not one line, not one sentence, not one message left behind for her. 45 years, and on white paper marked in black ink, she did not exist. Tyson sat at the end of the table and heard every word. When Orson closed the briefcase, Tyson rose, fastened one button of his suit jacket with one hand, and walked out of the room without saying a single word. But Maggie saw her son's jaw tighten, and she knew that behind that stone face, something was boiling that Tyson had not yet allowed to spill over. Priscilla didn't wait until the next day. That same afternoon, she moved Maggie's things out of the master bedroom. The clothes were folded neatly and placed on a chair in the storage room at the back of the house, a room 2 by 3 meters with no window, where they kept mop buckets, brooms, and bottles of bleach. On the floor was a thin mattress that Priscilla had dragged down from the attic, the kind of mattress meant for guests that no one had ever used. When Maggie went upstairs looking for her things and saw that the bedroom had changed owners, she stood in the doorway and looked inside without taking another step, then turned and went down to the storage room, sat on the mattress, and counted what she had. For 7 nights she lay in that room, listening to Priscilla's footsteps overhead, the laughter, the television, the sound of her grandchild running through the hallway, the little one she had bathed, fed, and read to every night for 5 years, and now Priscilla wouldn't let her touch the child without permission. On the 5th night, at 11 o'clock, Maggie heard the familiar heavy footsteps on the stairs. Tyson appeared in the doorway of the storage room, looking at his mother sitting on the mattress, mending an old coat under the beam of a flashlight, because the room had only one broken light bulb that no one had replaced. He stood there looking at that scene, and for the first time in many years, something in his face cracked, only for a second, then closed again. He set a thick envelope of cash on the edge of the bed without speaking. Maggie didn't look at the envelope. She didn't touch it. She lifted her eyes to her son and said, "You take care of your empire, I'll take care of my life." Tyson stood there for 10 seconds, his jaw clenched hard, then turned and walked out. It was the first time in 20 years that Tyson Aldridge had stood before a situation he had no way to control, because the person facing him wasn't a rival or a subordinate, but his mother. In the dark before dawn on the 8th day, before the sky began to lighten, Maggie rose from the mattress, packed into an old leather suitcase, a kitchen knife, a copper pot, a change of clothes, and took out the $1,400 she had sewn into the lining of her coat many years earlier, money Priscilla didn't know existed. She stepped out through the back door without leaving a note, without looking back, and disappeared into the darkness of Boston at 4 o'clock in the morning. Maggie walked south, following the edge of Boston Harbor while the sky was still pitch dark and the October wind sliced into the collar of her coat, passing rows of old warehouses, passing the docklands where the smell of engine oil mixed with the salt of the sea, until the last houses disappeared, and what opened before her was an industrial scrapyard of nearly 2 acres that the city of Boston had forgotten long ago, a place where people dumped scrap metal, rotten wood, rusted sheets of tin, broken machinery, and everything else the whole city no longer wanted to keep. The iron fence around it was torn open in 3 places, weeds pushed up through cracked concrete, and the smell of rust mixed with damp air from the sea into something heavy that clung to clothing. Maggie stepped in through a gap in the fence, set down her suitcase, stood in the middle of the wreckage, and felt nothing. Not fear, not sorrow, not hope. Only an emptiness inside her so vast it almost had weight, heavier even than pain, because pain at least lets a person know she is still alive, while emptiness gives nothing at all. But then, as if her hands knew something her mind had not yet understood, she bent down. She picked up a sheet of tin, turned it over in her hands, set it aside. She picked up a length of wood, ran her hand over it to see whether it was still solid, set it on the other side. In those first days, there was no plan, no drawing, no intention beyond movement. Hands lifting, eyes judging, sorting, tin on one side, wood on the other, iron that could still be used kept separately. On the second day, she cleared a stretch of concrete wide enough to lie down on. On the third day, she found a plastic tarp to keep off the rain. On the fourth day, she began to assemble, using 2 old wooden doors taken from a collapsed cabinet, propping them upright, wedging them with stones, and tying them together with steel wire pulled from a rusted spring bed frame, then roofing the top with sheets of tin whose edges she bent so rainwater would run off instead of collecting there. Everything came from the scrapyard. Everything had once been trash, until Maggie looked at it and decided what it could become. The dock workers who passed by each morning saw her dragging wood, carrying tin, and they laughed. The scrapyard old woman, that was what they called her. One afternoon, a local police officer came by and told her she couldn't stay there, that the land belonged to the city. Maggie straightened her back, looked at him, and asked, "Do you have any papers that say so?" The officer had no papers, looked around at the structure taking shape, looked back at the 65-year-old woman standing in the sun with scratches and rust all over her hands, scratched the back of his neck, then left and never returned. In Back Bay, Tyson got word about his mother the very day she left. He didn't call, didn't come, didn't ask her to return, because he knew his mother, and he knew that once Maggie Aldridge had decided something, there wasn't a force in this world that could change it, not even him. But that night, he called in his 2 most trusted men who belonged to no side except his, and said only one sentence: "Not a hair on her head is to be touched. You watch from a distance, and if she finds out, I'll deal with both of you." From that moment on, every night, 1 row of warehouses away from the scrapyard, there was always a black car parked in the dark, with 2 men taking turns keeping watch. And Maggie never knew. 2 weeks after Maggie left, on a November morning when fog from the harbor crept into the scrapyard so thick that the fence could barely be seen, a child appeared at the gap in the iron barrier. Bowie, 11 years old, the grandson Maggie had bathed, fed, and read to every night for 5 years. The child Priscilla kept in the Back Bay mansion, not out of love but because he was something that belonged to the house, like the curtains or a flower vase, something you left in place if it was there, and barely remembered if it was gone. The boy was thinner than the last time Maggie had seen him, thin in the way of a child who had gone 2 weeks without anyone reminding him to eat on time. His eyes shadowed dark beneath them, and on his left arm was a bruise turning from purple to yellow. Not the bruise of a child who had been beaten, but the bruise of a child who had fallen down the stairs because there had been no one to catch him, no one to see, no one there to know he had fallen. Bowie stood at the fence watching his grandmother kneeling on the concrete floor, tying steel wire to a wooden door frame, and she saw him but didn't call out, didn't run to him. I didn't ask, "Why are you here?" because Maggie understood something many adults never do, that sometimes the only thing a child needs isn't a question but a place to stand where no one asks anything at all. 10 minutes passed. The old woman working, the boy standing and watching, the fog rolling between them as though the whole world had disappeared, and only this scrapyard remained, until Maggie needed to hold a long plank that one hand couldn't manage, and she looked up and said, "If you're going to stand there, come here and hold this for me." Bowie stepped through the gap in the fence, walked straight to her, took the other end of the plank in both hands, and held it tight without saying a word. They worked that whole morning, she pointing with her hands, the boy understanding with his eyes. No explanations, no instructions, just the way Maggie had learned in her mother's kitchen 60 years earlier. Watch first, then do. Do first, then understand. At noon, Maggie sat down, broke a loaf of bread in half that she had bought with her savings from the corner grocery store, spread a thin layer of peanut butter on it, and placed 1/2 in Bowie's hand, without asking whether he was hungry. The boy ate quickly in the way of someone who doesn't know when the next meal will come, swallowing large bites in a rush as if afraid someone might snatch it back. And Maggie watched the way he ate, and knew everything she needed to know without asking another single question. She asked, "What's your name?" even though she knew perfectly well, because she wanted the boy to say it himself, to choose his own way of beginning. "Bowie," he answered. Maggie looked at the bruise on his arm but didn't ask. Bowie saw her looking but didn't speak, and that was enough. That evening, when grandmother and grandson sat inside the wall of wooden doors that had now been sealed against the wind on one side, Bowie was staring at the floor and spoke without lifting his head, My mother says I'm an extra mouth in the house. Maggie was cutting a length of steel wire. She didn't stop her hands, didn't look up, didn't change her breathing, because she knew that if she reacted too strongly, the boy would never say another sentence like that again. She stayed silent for a moment, long enough for Bowie to think she hadn't heard. Then she said, "Your mother doesn't know how to count, because here I need 2 hands, and you brought exactly 2. Bowie didn't answer, but his shoulders dropped. The kind of dropping that happens when someone has just set down something heavy they have carried for so long they forgot they were carrying it. The next morning Bowie came back. The morning after that, he came again. No one asked until when. No one said stay or go. The boy simply didn't leave anymore, and Maggie simply always broke the bread in half instead of eating alone. Inside the black car parked 3 rows of warehouses away from the scrapyard. One of the 2 men on watch called Tyson and reported, "Your mother's with the kid Bowie." He found his way there on his own. There were 5 seconds of silence on the other end. Then Tyson hung up. His driver said later that Tyson gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. But he didn't say a single word. And he didn't turn the car around. Because Tyson Aldridge knew that Bowie, the child who didn't share Aldridge blood but carried the Aldridge name, the child his own mother called an extra mouth, had just chosen his place for himself. And it was a place Tyson himself still didn't have the courage to step into. On an early November morning, while Maggie was tying a sheet of tin onto the roof frame and Bowie was sitting on the ground sorting straight nails from bent ones, an old man appeared at the edge of the scrapyard. Earl Whitfield, 72 years old, in a gray knit cap, a thick cloth coat patched at both elbows, and carrying an oak toolbox long past its prime. He stood there with his arms folded, looking at the structure Maggie had built, his head tilting slowly to one side and then the other, not in the way of someone criticizing, but in the way of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. Earl Whitfield had been Henry Aldridge's advisor for 35 years, the man behind every major decision in the empire, the one who knew the name of every ship, every shipment, every agreement, and every secret Henry had buried the deepest. When Henry died, Priscilla pushed Earl out first, because he knew too much, and she knew he would never bow to someone he didn't respect. Earl lived alone in a rented apartment in Dorchester, walking every morning from 5 o'clock on because if he sat still, his hands shook, a trembling that had begun 3 years earlier, when the owner of a woodworking shop on Dot Avenue let him go with a pat on the shoulder and $100, telling him his hands were no longer steady enough for the trade. He walked, because walking made his hands shake less, and he didn't know how to do anything else except keep moving. That morning, he stopped at the scrapyard because he heard hammering, and hammering always pulled Earl Whitfield in the way the smell of coffee pulls people into a kitchen. "Who built those door frames?" he asked without introducing himself. "I did," Maggie answered from inside, threading steel wire through the nail holes in the tin. "You're missing a support point on the second crossbeam," Earl said, his voice calm as if he were commenting on the weather. "If you don't brace it, the first heavy rain will bend the frame and bring the whole thing down on your head." Maggie stepped out and looked at him. "I know it's missing," she said. "I don't have anything to brace it with." Earl didn't answer. He opened his toolbox, took out a chisel, a handsaw, and a bottle of wood glue, then got to work. He found a solid oak beam from the pile of scrap, sawed it to the right size, wedged it into the support point, glued it, and fixed it in place with wooden shims he carved right there on the spot. 3 hours passed without another word, only the sound of the saw and the chisel. His hands shook when he held the cup of tea Maggie gave him afterward, but when he held a chisel, they didn't shake. Bowie sat beside him, watching him work with the gaze of a child, seeing for the first time an adult turn a pile of broken wood into something with shape, using nothing but bare hands. Before he left, Earl said, "I'll come back Tuesday and bring more glue." He came back on Tuesday, then Thursday, then Saturday, then every day. He asked for nothing, demanded nothing, brought his tools, worked in silence, ate what Maggie cooked, and left before dark. He taught Bowie how to measure length with the span of his hand, and with his knuckles when there was no ruler. Taught him how to read the grain of wood, so he would know where to cut without splitting it. And the boy learned with his eyes, not his mouth, exactly the way Maggie had learned from her mother 60 years earlier. 3 weeks after Earl arrived, the shelter had 2 rooms sealed against the wind, with sturdy walls made from fitted wooden doors, a stove built from bricks gathered from the scrapyard, where Maggie cooked bean soup in the copper pot, and a small courtyard that caught the light through window frames without glass, that Earl had installed at an angle so rain wouldn't blow in. Bowie slept in the second room on an old mattress that Maggie had aired out for 3 days in the sun and the sea wind before letting him lie on it. No one ever asked how long he was staying, and he never said. 3 people. An old woman, an old man, a boy. Not a family because they didn't share a single drop of blood, but something with no name in any language, something that is sometimes stronger than blood, because blood is what people are born with, while this was something people chose every day when they came back. One night, in the middle of the week, Earl met Tyson at a dark bar in Dorchester, the two of them sitting across from each other with 2 glasses of whiskey. Neither of them drank. "Your father didn't write a foolish will," Earl said, looking straight at Tyson. "Henry hid something more important than every will in the world, and your mother is sitting exactly where that thing lies." Tyson didn't ask what it was, didn't ask where. He only looked at Earl for 3 seconds and gave one nod, the kind of nod passed between 2 men who had already said everything that needed saying without needing one more syllable. On another night, Tyson's black car parked right outside the scrapyard instead of 3 rows of warehouses away like always. Lamplight spilled through the cracks in the wooden wall, in a thin yellow line across the wet concrete. The driver glanced at Tyson in the back seat and asked, "Are you going in?" "No." Tyson sat there for 20 minutes, looking at that line of light, watching the shadows moving inside, hearing Bowie's quiet laughter somewhere within and Earl tapping lightly on wood with a hammer. Then he said, "Drive." Because Tyson Aldridge, the man half of Boston feared, the man who gave orders with a nod and destroyed lives with a single phone call, didn't know how to step through a sheet metal door and sit beside his mother without bringing with him the weight of everything he had become. In Southie, rumors traveled faster than the sea wind. A dock worker at the harbor told the bartender at the bar on the corner of L Street that Tyson Aldridge's mother was living in a scrapyard, building a house with her own hands out of discarded things. The bartender told his wife when the bar closed. His wife told the neighbor the next morning on the way to the market. The neighbor told Father Murray at St. Augustine Church after Saturday afternoon confession, and Father Murray told no one, but he mentioned it in his Sunday sermon, never naming names. Yet everyone knew who he meant, because in Southie there was only one old woman living in a scrapyard, and that old woman happened to carry the name Aldridge. Every question people asked each other about Maggie was a finger pointed straight at Priscilla's chest, and Priscilla felt it because she was the kind of woman who always knew when other people were looking at her, especially when they were looking with judgment in their eyes. On a Wednesday morning in early December, Priscilla appeared at the edge of the scrapyard. She was wearing a fitted gray knit dress, walking in high heels across cracked concrete, carrying a Hermes bag in one hand and a box of cannoli from a famous bakery in the North End in the other. Italian pastries wrapped in wax paper and tied with red string, brought to an Irish family she had lived with for 6 years but had never truly belonged to. And that small detail said more than any sentence she could have spoken. Priscilla stood at the fence, looking in at the structure Maggie, Earl, and Bowie had built over the past weeks. 2 rooms sealed against the wind, a neat tin roof, a courtyard with sunlight, and her face twisted into something difficult to read. Not contempt, not pity, but irritation. The kind of irritation that comes over a person looking at something she doesn't want to exist, and yet there it stands, steady and deserving. Because if Maggie had been living in a collapsing shack, Priscilla could have told all of Southie that the old woman had lost her mind from grief, and people would have nodded with sympathy, and then forgotten. But what stood in front of Priscilla wasn't a shack. It was a home, built from things no one else had wanted to look at, and it made Priscilla look worse than any rumor ever could. "Mother," Priscilla said in the voice she used when she wanted to sound gentle, "people are talking. Tyson wants you to come home. Don't do this anymore." She held out the box of cannoli like a peace offering. Maggie was kneeling on the concrete floor, scraping rust off an old hinge she meant to attach to the kitchen door. And she didn't look up, didn't stand, didn't look at the pastries or the dress or the handbag that cost as much as a whole year's rent for a family in Southie. She said, "Tell Tyson his mother says thank you, and take the pastries back with you, because here we eat what we cook ourselves." Priscilla stood there with the box in her hand, her mouth slightly open, searching for an answer and finding none. Because there is no answer for someone who doesn't even bother to look at you. Then she turned on her heel, the sound of high heels striking cracked concrete as she walked away, her back stiff like someone who had just been slapped by a sentence softer than the wind. Bowie was sitting on the floor beside the pile of nails he was sorting, watching Priscilla disappear beyond the fence. Then he turned to Maggie and said, "She smells like expensive perfume." Maggie stopped working, looked at the boy. and laughed. It was a small laugh, quiet, a little rough, as if the muscles in her face had forgotten how to make that movement after too many weeks without using it. It was the first time Maggie Aldridge had laughed since the day Henry died, and that laughter came not from joy but from something closer, something small and warm that only an 11-year-old boy sitting in the middle of a pile of rusted nails could have brought into the world. While Maggie was building a home out of discarded things, Priscilla was building something else, a trap tightening around Tyson's neck without ever needing a rope. After leaving the scrapyard that day with the box of cannoli still untouched in her hand, Priscilla wasn't angry. She was calculating, because Priscilla was the kind of woman who turned every humiliation into fuel. In the first week, she used her legal inheritance rights to sign the order freezing Aldridge Maritime's main accounts, cutting off the only stream of money Tyson used to launder cash and keep the underground machine alive. In the second week, she met privately with every ship captain at the harbor, every warehouse manager, every transport driver, and gave them one simple choice. Come with me, or get out of the harbor. There is no third option. Most of them chose Priscilla, not out of loyalty but because of money. And in this world, loyalty without money is nothing more than a beautiful, useless word. Tyson's empire began to choke. Goods couldn't leave the harbor. Money couldn't enter the accounts. And the links Henry had spent 40 years building were being pulled out one by Priscilla, like someone unraveling thread from a sweater. Tyson knew, and Tyson didn't panic, because Tyson Aldridge doesn't panic. He only becomes more dangerous. One night, in the middle of the week, he sat in the garage basement of a warehouse in Charlestown across from a man who had once been one of Henry's lieutenants, a man who had just switched to Priscilla's side. Tyson asked nothing, threatened nothing, gave no order for anyone to hit anyone. He only sat there on a wooden chair, one leg crossed over the other, both hands resting on his knees, and looked. Silence. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. The man across from him began to sweat across his forehead, even though the garage basement was so cold, their breath was visible. And by the 20th minute, he started confessing everything Tyson hadn't even asked yet. Confessing the way someone opens a pressure valve because he can't bear the force building inside anymore. Tyson Aldridge's presence itself was violence. The kind of violence that doesn't leave bruises but leaves marks inside a person's mind that never quite fade. But that night, after leaving the garage basement with every piece of information he needed, Tyson didn't go back to the penthouse. He drove south, toward the harbor, toward the scrapyard. And for the first time, he stepped out of the car, walked through the gap in the iron fence, and entered the shelter. Inside, Maggie was sitting beside the brick stove, stirring a pot of bean soup in the copper pot, the small fire throwing light across the wooden walls and making warm shadows move slowly across the tin ceiling. Bowie was asleep in the other room. Earl had already gone back to Dorchester. Maggie heard the footsteps and didn't turn around, because she recognized her son's footsteps the way she had once recognized Henry's. Heavy, steady, with the slightest drag in the toe of the left shoe. "Are you hungry?" she asked without turning. Tyson stood in the doorway for 3 seconds, then stepped inside, sat down on an overturned wooden crate Earl used as a chair, and said nothing. Maggie ladled out a bowl of bean soup from the copper pot, placed it in front of her son with a piece of bread, and sat down across from him. Tyson looked at the bowl of soup, looked at the copper pot, the same pot his mother had taken with her the night she left the mansion, the same pot his grandmother had given his mother on her wedding day. He picked up the spoon and ate. For the first time in 15 years, Tyson Aldridge was eating something his mother had cooked, because for 15 years, he had eaten in restaurants, eaten in the penthouse, eaten food prepared by other people, but he couldn't remember the last time he had sat down and eaten a bowl of soup his mother made for him. There was nothing special about the soup, white beans, celery, potatoes, salt, but it had something no restaurant in Boston had, the taste of someone who had known what he liked to eat since before he knew how to speak. No one said a word through the entire meal. They didn't need to. When Tyson set the spoon down and rose to his feet, Maggie looked at him and said, "Don't take revenge for me. I don't need anyone to avenge me. But if you take revenge for yourself, make sure you know exactly what you're avenging." Tyson looked at his mother, didn't nod, didn't answer, but he heard her, and Maggie knew he heard her, because his eyes changed. Just for a moment, something softer passing through the stone before the stone closed again. He stepped back outside, stood there in the December harbor, wind blowing in from the Atlantic, sharp, salty, cutting cold, and for the first time in many years, Tyson Aldridge took a breath without calculating what would come after it. In the weeks that followed, Maggie pushed the cleanup deeper into the back of the scrapyard, into the part no one had touched for decades. The oldest stretch pressed against the harbor wall, where the scrap had been piled so long it no longer looked like trash at all, but like earth itself. Layers of broken concrete, mixed with shattered brick and rusted iron, compressed into something hard as stone under the weight of time. In December, the Atlantic wind blew straight into Boston Harbor, with a cold so sharp that the water left standing on the concrete turned into a thin sheet of ice every morning, and Maggie worked through that cold with cracked hands. The old cloth gloves Earl had given her not thick enough to keep her warm, but enough to keep her skin from tearing when she gripped the iron. One afternoon, when the sun was already dropping early, and the light was coming only in a slant through the gap between the two western warehouses, Maggie was using the short shovel Earl had fitted with a new handle to dig through a mound of broken concrete when the blade struck something that gave off a sound unlike anything she had ever heard in that scrapyard. It wasn't the sound of stone striking stone, wasn't the clatter of scrap metal, but a low, solid, resonant sound. The kind of sound thick steel makes when something hard hits it, a sound with depth, with weight, as if beneath the shovel blade there wasn't ground at all, but an empty space. Maggie stopped. She struck the same place again with the shovel. The same sound. She set the shovel down, dropped to her knees, and began digging with her hands. Bowie was out in front of the shelter, heard the strange sound of earth being clawed away, ran over, and knelt beside her without asking, and grandmother and grandson dug together, bare hands pushing aside broken concrete, shattered brick, packed earth. It took them nearly an hour to clear deep enough to expose what lay underneath. And what lay there wasn't scrap iron or an old pipe. It was a rectangular steel plate, nearly the size of a dining table, as thick as 3 fingers pressed together, with 2 rows of rivets running along the edges, the kind of industrial rivets people used for ship hulls or bridge beams. The steel plate had been laid flat, set horizontally, braced between massive stones as supports, and above it was a layer of broken concrete mixed with packed earth so thick that it was obvious someone had covered it deliberately to hide it. It wasn't something that had fallen there by chance, wasn't a piece of construction debris. It was a cover, and someone had placed it there on purpose and wanted no one ever to find it. At one corner, the steel plate curved up slightly, leaving a gap just wide enough for a hand to slip into, and from that gap came a current of cold air that Maggie knew at once was different from sea wind or the chill of December. This was a damp, heavy cold, carrying the smell of minerals and old brick, the kind of cold that rises from below, from somewhere deep, somewhere sealed, somewhere that hadn't seen light in a very long time. Bowie pressed his face close to the gap, drew in a breath, widened his eyes, and said, "It smells strange, like when it rains on the road even though it isn't raining." Maggie didn't answer. She laid the palm of her hand against the steel, felt the rivets beneath her skin, felt the cold air pushing through the gap against her wrist, and she knew with the same kind of instinct with which she had known Henry was dead before anyone called, that beneath this steel plate there was something someone had wanted buried, and it had lain there a very long time, waiting. Earl came to the scrapyard at 6 o'clock the next morning, carrying the heaviest crowbar he owned, a solid steel bar he had kept from his days at the woodworking shop, something he hadn't used in over 10 years but had never thrown away. 3 people, an old woman, an old man, a boy, slid the crowbar into the gap at the bent corner and pushed. The steel plate didn't move. They pushed again, Earl and Maggie throwing all their strength onto the crowbar, Bowie shoving stones underneath as wedges every time the steel lifted even half an inch. 2 hours. 2 hours of pushing, wedging, pushing, wedging, until the steel plate finally slid far enough for them to see below. The first thing they saw was darkness, a round mouth more than 1.5 meters wide dropping into the earth. The second thing was the smell. Clean, damp, mineral. The same stream of cold air Maggie had felt through the gap, but now stronger, more real. Earl lay flat at the rim, lowered his head into the darkness, and stayed silent for a long time. When he sat back up, his face held the expression of a man who had just seen something he couldn't quite believe was real. "This is a wine cellar," he said softly, taking off his knit cap and scratching his head, built in brick, with arches. Maggie lay flat and looked down and saw it. The cellar was about 4 meters deep, its walls built of red brick laid in a herringbone pattern, the kind of construction she had seen before, only in old photographs of 19th century Boston, and the ceiling held 3 brick arches, crossing one another to form a ribbed structure, supporting the roof like the rib cage of some giant sleeping beast. The cellar was dry, but on the walls there were old watermarks, dark horizontal lines showing how high the water had once risen in the past, and in the mortar near the bottom there was damp green moss, proving that the water wasn't far away. Henry's father used to talk about underground cellars along the harbor from the Prohibition years, Earl said, his eyes still fixed downward. Everybody thought he was making it up. Bowie pushed his head between the 2 adults, peered into the darkness, and asked, "Is this a well?" "Not a well," Earl said, shaking his head. "This is a storage cellar, the kind of place people used to hide things the law wasn't allowed to find." But Maggie wasn't listening to either of them, because her eyes were fixed on something neither Earl nor Bowie had yet seen, a rectangular wall niche in the eastern side of the cellar, about half a meter below the opening, the size of a shoebox, and inside that niche there was something. Maggie lowered herself down. Earl shouted, "Careful, the bricks could be rotten," but she was already descending, both hands gripping the stone rim, her feet searching for holds in the bricks jutting out from the wall, half her body suspended in the dark cellar. She stretched her left hand toward the niche, and her fingers touched cold metal. She gripped it and pulled. What came out of the niche was a rectangular steel box, far heavier than she had expected. Its lid rusted shut against the body as if time itself had sealed it closed, and when Maggie held it to her chest while Earl pulled her back up, she felt its weight not only in her arms but in her whole rib cage. The weight of something that had rested still in darkness for a very long time, waiting for the right person to come and find it. The 3 of them sat on the concrete floor around the steel box, their breath turning to white mist in the cold morning air, and no one said a word while Maggie took the kitchen knife out of her suitcase, the same knife her mother had given her, the same knife she had carried with her the night she left the Back Bay mansion at 4 a.m, the same knife she had used to cut the wire that held the walls together, shave down the wood wedges for the door, break bread to share with Bowie, and now she slid the tip of it into the seam between the lid and the body of the box, where rust had welded the 2 halves together as if time itself wanted to keep this secret for another century. She pushed the blade in, twisted, pushed harder, and the rust gave with a dry, clean crack like the sound of bone breaking, and the lid sprang open. Inside, wrapped in a layer of oilcloth that might once have been green but had now darkened to nearly black, were 2 things. Maggie unfolded the oilcloth with fingers that trembled slightly, not trembling from the cold but from a feeling she couldn't yet name, and the first thing revealed was a ledger, a dark brown leather cover, thick as 2 fingers, a stitched spine, every page filled in black ink with the neat, slanted handwriting of someone used to recording things, line after line, column after column, names, sums of money, dates, places, who paid, who received, who owed, who betrayed. The Black Ledger of the Aldridge Empire, recording every underground transaction from the time of Henry's father through Henry's own years, nearly half a century of secrets resting in handwritten ink on yellowed paper. Earl leaned closer to look, his eyes widening, and he knew what he was seeing because he had heard Henry mention this ledger only once, on a late night when the 2 of them had been drinking in the harbor office, when Henry said there was a book that recorded everything, and that if it ever fell into the wrong hands, the whole empire would collapse in a single night. Then Henry changed the subject and never brought it up again. Maggie turned the pages one by one. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough. The names she had heard around the house for 45 years now appeared beside numbers, agreements, payments that had never once been entered into the company books. And in the final pages, in a different hand, newer, a hand Maggie recognized at once because she had read it on hundreds of notes, Henry had left on the kitchen table all her life. There was clear proof that Priscilla had secretly been transferring money from Henry's accounts to the Kozlov family, beginning 2 years before Henry died. 2 years. Priscilla had been preparing to steal the empire while Henry was still alive, while she was still sitting at the family table eating dinner with all of them, while Maggie was still cooking her meals every day. Maggie set the ledger down and looked at the second thing inside the box. A ring. A silver signet ring blackened with age, its face engraved with the letter A inside a small shield. The kind of engraving done by hand, not by machine. Every line pressed into the metal by a craftsman's hand. Maggie picked it up, turned it over, and saw a line carved into the inside with a rough tool, the letters uneven but solid, as if whoever carved them didn't care whether they were beautiful, only that they would last forever. For those who don't fold. Maggie read it silently. Then she read it aloud, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, and each word fell into the cold morning air as if it carried weight. She read it a third time but couldn't finish because her lips trembled and she had to close her eyes. And it wasn't because of sorrow or joy or relief, but because of something deeper than all of those things put together. The feeling that comes when someone who has walked through everything suddenly finds proof that she was never invisible. Bowie placed his small hand on her arm, lightly, without speaking, only to let her know he was there. Earl took off his knit cap, held it against his chest, and looked away. No one knew who had placed the box inside the wall niche in that wine cellar. It might have been Henry's father, the first man who built the Aldridge Empire with bootleg liquor and nerve during Prohibition. It might have been Henry himself, the man who hid it because he knew the time hadn't come yet and that someone patient enough would need to find it at exactly the right moment. The box had lain in the darkness of a sealed brick cellar beneath a riveted steel plate under decades of concrete and scrap, perhaps half a century, perhaps longer, and it had waited. Earl called Tyson at 10 o'clock that night and said only one sentence. "You need to come here," then hung up. Tyson didn't call back. He drove alone to the South Boston harbor. No bodyguards, no driver, no one knowing where he was going, and reached the scrapyard at 2 o'clock in the morning. The shelter was silent. Bowie was asleep in the next room. Maggie sat beside the cellar opening with the steel box placed in front of her. Earl stood behind her with his arms folded, and when Tyson stepped inside, neither of them said a word. They only looked toward the black mouth in the concrete floor. Tyson looked at the cellar, looked at his mother, looked at Earl. Then, without needing anyone to explain, he lowered himself down. He gripped the stone rim, found footing on the bricks jutting from the wall the exact same way Maggie had done a few hours earlier, and when both feet touched the cellar floor, he stood in the darkness beneath the herringbone brick vault above his head and turned on the flashlight on his phone. Earl lowered the ledger down to him. Tyson took it, sat on the cellar floor with his back against the cold brick wall, and began to read. He read slowly, page by page, his fingers turning the paper lightly, as though afraid the ink might fall away, but his other hand held the spine so tightly that the leather cover gave a faint creak beneath the pressure of fingers long used to gripping everything and never letting go. Every page peeled back another layer of secrets. The names of men he had once shared whiskey with, once shaken hands with, once called brothers, now lying on paper beside numbers showing they had sold him out long before he ever knew it. And in the final pages, Priscilla's name, transactions with the Kozlov family, Henry's money flowing to the enemy beginning 2 years before he died. Each amount, each day, each line clear proof that the woman sitting in the Back Bay mansion had been preparing to kill the Aldridge Empire, while Henry was still sitting at the dinner table every night and knew nothing about it. Tyson finished the final page. He sat motionless in the cellar, the beam of the flashlight striking the arched brick ceiling and casting sharp, curved shadows across the walls. And in the silence of that cellar, 4 meters beneath the ground, he could hear water dripping somewhere inside the brickwork. Slow and steady, like the counting pulse of time, he placed the ledger on his lap, picked up the blackened silver signet ring Maggie had set on top of it, turned it in his hand, looked at the letter A engraved on its face, then flipped it over and read the line carved inside under the light of his phone. For those who don't fold, he didn't read it aloud, but his lips moved with each word, and he slid the ring onto the ring finger of his right hand, the same hand he used to sign orders, to hold a gun, to close around the wrist of a traitor, the hand that in 37 years had never held anyone else's, because Tyson Aldridge was not the kind of man who held hands. The ring fit perfectly. He lifted his head and looked at his mother standing at the rim of the cellar above him, her face half in light and half in shadow, and he said, "You found what the whole empire couldn't find in 20 years." Maggie looked down at her son sitting at the bottom of a 19th century brick cellar, the most powerful man in Boston looking small beneath those old arches, and she said, "I didn't find anything. I was only clearing trash." It showed itself to whoever had enough patience. Tyson looked at his mother, and something inside him, the thing he had built walls around for 20 years, the thing he had buried beneath layers of stone and iron, and the silence of a man who never allowed himself to be weak in front of anyone. That thing cracked open. He stepped to the wall directly below where Maggie stood, dropped to both knees on the cold brick floor, and pressed his forehead against his mother's hand reaching down from the edge of the opening. The most ruthless mafia boss in Boston knelt at the bottom of a Prohibition-era wine cellar, his forehead resting against the cracked, rust-scarred hand of the woman who had built a home out of garbage. And he said nothing, because there were no words large enough for that moment. Maggie brought down her other hand and laid it on her son's head, lightly, the way she had done when he was a boy and afraid of the dark, and she said nothing either, because she understood that sometimes the strongest thing a mother can do is stay silent and be there. Bowie stood at the cellar opening, looking down, his eyes wide, both hands gripping the stone rim. And the boy didn't understand everything that was happening, but he understood enough, because he was a child who already knew what it meant to be left behind, and he recognized at once the sight of someone being held instead. Earl stood behind Bowie, turned his face toward the sea, took off his knit cap and brushed the back of his hand once across his eyes, then put the cap back on. No one saw. No one needed to. Tyson left the cellar that night, with the ledger in his hand and the ring on his ring finger. And from the moment he sat behind the wheel at 4 a.m, he was no longer the man kneeling at the bottom of the cellar, but Tyson Aldridge, as all of Boston knew him, cold, precise, and methodical. He didn't rush. He didn't call anyone, didn't meet anyone, didn't give a single order in the first 48 hours. He sat in the penthouse and read the ledger again from the first page to the last 2 more times, using a marker to note every name, every number, every connection, redrawing in his mind the map of power his father had built and Priscilla was destroying until he could see every thread clearly, and he knew exactly which thread to cut first, which one to cut after, and which one to leave untouched so it would snap on its own. On the 3rd day, he began. The first move wasn't an attack but a photograph. He took a picture of the cover of the ledger. Only the cover, not opening it, not showing what was inside, then sent it to Priscilla with a single line of text. Father left behind more than you think. No signature. He didn't need one. Priscilla looked at the photograph at 9 a.m. while drinking coffee in the kitchen of the Back Bay mansion, and according to what a maid later said, the coffee cup slipped from her hand and shattered across the marble floor. But she didn't look down, her eyes fixed on the phone screen like someone seeing a ghost in broad daylight. She called Orson Webb immediately. No answer. She called a second time, a third, a fourth, voicemail. Orson Webb had disappeared from Boston the night before, because in this world, bad news moves faster than telephones, and Orson was smart enough to know when to run before someone decided he didn't need to run anymore. Priscilla called the Kozlov family in the northern part of the city, the number she had called every week for the past 2 years. Silence. No one answered. No one called back. And that silence was more frightening than any threat, because it meant the Kozlovs knew, and when the Kozlovs knew and chose silence, it meant they were cutting the line to Priscilla before that same line dragged them down with her. From there, Tyson cut each connection one by one. He didn't call, didn't text, didn't threaten. He simply let each person named in the ledger know that he knew, in different ways, an unmarked envelope containing a copy of the ledger page with their name on it left on their desk in the morning, a brief 2-minute meeting in a parking lot where he said one sentence and walked away, a 30-second phone call where he read out a number and a date, then hung up. One by one, Priscilla's alliances fell like dominoes. The account she used to pay the people at the harbor was frozen, because Tyson knew exactly which account had been opened by whom, and he needed only one phone call to the right person at the bank. Business partners pulled away because they realized the person they had been working with wasn't the rightful head of the empire but the one who had stolen it. And no one wants to stand beside a thief when the owner of the house comes home. Officials who had once accepted envelopes from Priscilla stopped answering her calls because their names were in the ledger, and they feared Tyson more than they feared losing money. And then, in those same days, while Priscilla sat in the Back Bay mansion watching the empire she thought she had secured come apart piece by piece, other secrets began to surface. Secrets the ledger recorded, and Tyson let leak in exactly the right places, at exactly the right moments. Priscilla had slept with Orson Webb to manipulate him into keeping the old will unchanged, and never telling Maggie that she had the right to contest it. And Bowie, the child the entire Aldridge family had called their grandson, wasn't Reed's biological son, but Priscilla's child from a relationship before she met Reed. The boy Reed had known about and still accepted. The boy Henry had known about and still loved. The boy Maggie had known about and loved most of all. But Priscilla, his biological mother, had neglected more than anyone, calling him an extra mouth, and letting him fall on the stairs with no one there to catch him. Tyson Aldridge didn't need to hit anyone. He didn't need a gun, didn't need threats, didn't need to shout. He only needed them to know that he knew. And the silence that came after. That empty space between the moment they realized he knew and the moment they still didn't know what he would do, that silence was more terrifying than any bullet. Priscilla was backed into a corner, and when a wild animal is backed into a corner, it bites. As each alliance fell away and each phone call went to voicemail, Priscilla understood that she no longer had enough power to play the long game. And when people have nothing left to lose, they do things they would never have dared to imagine when they were still thinking clearly. First, she hired 3 men she found through an old Kozlov contact, paid them in cash, and ordered them to break into the shelter at night and take the ledger at any cost. The 3 men came to the scrapyard at 2 o'clock in the morning on a weekday night, dressed in black and carrying crowbars. And when they climbed over the iron fence, they discovered they weren't the only ones awake that late. Out of the darkness, one by one, people stepped forward. The first 3 were dock workers from the harbor, men who stopped by Maggie's shelter after their shifts every night because she always had a pot of hot bean soup and never asked where they came from or what their names were. Then came 2 sailors, a truck driver, and an old man who lived in a van in the parking lot beside the harbor, the man Maggie had lent blankets to on the coldest nights. They said nothing, carried no weapons. They only stood there, 7 people, shoulder to shoulder, staring straight at the 3 men in black with the crowbars in their hands, and their eyes said more clearly than any words ever could that you are not getting in here. The 3 intruders looked at one another, looked at the 7 people standing still as a wall, then turned and walked away without another exchange. Not Mafia, not anyone's soldiers, just people Maggie had fed when they were hungry and never asked for anything in return, and that was the kind of loyalty no amount of money in this world could buy because it wasn't for sale. Priscilla got word of the failure and didn't sleep for 3 straight nights. On the 4th night, she made the decision she would later wish she had never even thought of. She contacted a gunman from out of state, a man who belonged to no side in Boston, a man who didn't know what the name Aldridge meant, only knew the number inside the envelope, and gave the order to aim at Maggie. Not at Tyson, not at Earl, but at the 65-year-old woman living in a shelter built from discarded things, because Priscilla understood something many people do not, that Maggie was the foundation, and if the foundation collapsed, everything above it would fall after it. But Priscilla forgot one thing. Tyson Aldridge had informants everywhere, in every camp, at every level, because he didn't buy loyalty with money but with fear. And fear of Tyson was much cheaper than Priscilla's money. One phone call at 11 o'clock that night, one trembling voice on the other end telling Tyson that a gunman was on his way to South Boston Harbor, and Tyson said nothing, not thank you, not a single word. He hung up and ran for the car. The black car tore through the Boston night, through the silent streets of Back Bay, across the overpass to Interstate 93, down into Southie, turning onto the road that ran along the harbor where weak yellow streetlights fell across the wet pavement, and Tyson reached the scrapyard 5 minutes before the gunman did. He didn't call his men, didn't call the police, didn't call anyone. He stood alone in front of the shelter door, both hands hanging at his sides, not drawing his gun even though he always carried one, and waited. When the gunman appeared at the iron fence, a middle-aged man in a long coat, his right hand buried in his pocket in the way everyone in that world knew the meaning of, he stopped because there was a man standing motionless in front of the shelter, looking straight at him, and that look, the way that man stood there, not defensive, not aggressive, only standing there as though he had known all along, that look made the gunman understand that he was facing the kind of man money wasn't enough to stand against. Tyson spoke, his voice even, neither rising nor falling. If you shoot her, it won't be you who dies. It'll be your whole bloodline, not tomorrow, but starting tonight. The gunman looked at Tyson for 3 seconds, pulled his hand out of his coat pocket, empty, turned around, and walked back into the darkness without looking behind him. Tyson stood there until the sound of the man's footsteps disappeared completely. Then he let out a breath, and his breath became a cloud of white mist, dissolving into the cold night. He stepped into the shelter. Inside, Maggie was sitting beside the brick stove, heating water for tea in the small pot, her back to the door, and she didn't turn around when she heard the footsteps, because she didn't need to. She said, "I knew it was you. You walk heavy like your father." Tyson stood in the doorway looking at his mother's back, looking at her shoulders, thin but straight, looking at the hand holding the teapot, not trembling in the slightest, even though she had heard everything that had happened outside the sheet metal door. And he understood that this woman, his mother, wasn't afraid of death. Not because she was brave, but because she had lived long enough to know that the most frightening thing in this world isn't a bullet, but living as though no one needs you, and she had already gone beyond that fear. 2 days after the night the gunman walked away, Tyson convened a family tribunal, not in the penthouse, not in a private restaurant or some garage basement in Charlestown, but at the very bottom of the underground cellar in the scrapyard, that 19th century red brick cellar his mother had dug up with her own hands, because Tyson wanted everyone in that room to understand that the place where they were standing was where every secret had begun and where every secret would end. They went down into the cellar by a rope ladder Earl had tied to the edge of the opening, one by one, the last 3 loyal lieutenants of the Aldridge Empire, the men who had not walked away when Priscilla took power, Earl standing in the corner of the cellar with his arms folded, Maggie seated on a flat stone against the eastern wall directly beneath the niche from which she had pulled the steel box, and finally Priscilla, brought there not entirely willingly by 2 of Tyson's men, climbing down the rope ladder with her high heels slipping on the wooden rungs, and her face pale beneath the flashlight beams hanging from the brick arches. Tyson stood in the middle of the cellar, the ledger open in his hands, the blackened silver ring on his ring finger catching the light every time he turned a page, and he began to read. His voice was even, never rising, never falling, with no emphasis, no expression, the voice of a man who didn't need to shout for everyone to hear, because everyone in that cellar knew that every word he spoke carried the weight of truth that couldn't be denied. He read every page connected to Priscilla, every transfer of money to the Kozlov family, every date, every number, and each number was a nail driven into the coffin Priscilla had built for herself. He read about the relationship between Priscilla and Orson Webb, about the way she had used Orson to preserve the old will and block Maggie from her inheritance rights. He read every line in the same voice, neither faster nor slower, and that steadiness was more terrifying than any rage could have been, because rage passes quickly, but Tyson Aldridge's calm does not. Priscilla stood against the opposite brick wall, and with every page Tyson turned, she drew in a little more, her shoulders collapsing another inch, until by the time he finished the last page and closed the ledger, Priscilla had slid down to sit on the brick floor, her gray knit dress smeared with dust, one heel of her shoe broken at some point without anyone noticing, and the face she had once controlled so perfectly was now cracked open like a porcelain mask thrown against the ground. "Reed died and I had nothing," Priscilla said, her voice breaking, her eyes fixed on the brick floor. "Reed died and no one asked if I was all right. No one looked at me except with the eyes of people calculating whether I was still useful for something. I did what I had to do." The cellar fell silent after those words, so silent that the drip of water in the brickwork and the breathing of 6 people in that cramped space, 4 meters beneath the earth, could be heard. Then Maggie stood up. She walked toward Priscilla slowly, one step at a time across the uneven brick floor, and she looked down at the woman sitting on the ground, and what was on Maggie's face wasn't hatred, wasn't contempt, wasn't satisfaction, but something only a person who had crossed the same abyss could recognize. She saw in Priscilla another version of herself. Both of them were women who had been left behind. Both had lost husbands, lost their place, lost everything they had believed belonged to them, but one had chosen to build from ruin, and one had chosen to take from another person's hands. And the distance between those 2 choices was the distance between this shelter and the Back Bay mansion, Maggie said, her voice neither loud nor soft nor trembling. "You could have stayed and built with me, but you chose to take." Priscilla lifted her face and looked at Maggie, and in her eyes there was something that had never been there before. Not regret, because Priscilla was not the kind of person who regretted, but acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that she had lost, not lost to Tyson or to the ledger or to money, but to the 65-year-old woman standing in front of her in cracked hands and old cloth slippers. Tyson waited until his mother had finished speaking. Then he delivered the judgment. His voice was still even, still cold, but anyone looking closely would have seen his fingers turn the blackened silver ring once around his ring finger before he spoke, and that small detail showed that this decision wasn't as easy for him as he wanted it to seem. He did not kill Priscilla. In Tyson's world, that was the choice many people would not understand, because Priscilla had hired someone to kill his mother, and by the law of the underworld, blood is paid for with blood. But Tyson had changed, not into a good man, not into a weak one, but into a man who understood that there are punishments heavier than death. "Strip her of everything," he said. "Every asset, every account, every connection. everything carrying the Aldridge name on paper. Out of Boston before morning, he took an envelope from inside his coat pocket and threw it onto the floor in front of Priscilla. $14,000, he said. 10 times what my mother had when she walked out of the house you took from her. More than you deserve to receive. Priscilla looked at the envelope on the brick floor, looked up at Tyson, looked over at Maggie, then picked up the envelope without saying another word. Because for the first time in Priscilla's life, there was nothing left to say. Priscilla left Boston before dawn, sitting in the back seat of a car driven by one of Tyson's men, with the envelope containing $14,000 in her handbag, and not a single person in the whole city came to see her off. That morning, when the first sunlight came through the window frames without glass in the shelter and fell across the concrete floor in a long band of gold, Bowie stood alone in the middle of the courtyard, his eyes dry, but both hands clenching the hem of his shirt and pulling it down until the fabric stretched tight, the way a child holds himself together when everything inside wants to collapse. The boy knew Priscilla was gone because he had heard everything the night before from the next room, heard Tyson's voice reading from the ledger, heard Priscilla's voice breaking apart, heard Maggie say the sentence he would remember forever, and he knew that the woman who had just left was his biological mother, the one who had called him an extra mouth, the one who last night hadn't spoken his name even once. Tyson stepped into the shelter, saw Bowie standing there in the sunlight with his hands gripping the fabric of his shirt, and stopped. He looked at the boy, and the boy looked at him, and in that moment, the two of them looked at each other with the eyes of people who both understood what it meant to have a mother, and yet not have one at all. Tyson walked over and knelt down, one knee on the concrete, until his eyes were level with Bowie's, because he understood that when you speak to a child while looking down at him, that is an order, but when you look straight across, that is a real question. "Where do you want to be?" he asked, in a voice his lieutenants would not have recognized, because it wasn't cold, wasn't even... It carried something softer, something Tyson Aldridge only allowed to exist when he was kneeling eye to eye with an 11-year-old boy, standing in a shelter built from discarded things. Bowie didn't answer right away. He turned his head and looked toward Maggie, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with both hands at her sides, and Maggie looked back at her grandson with eyes that had already said everything without needing words. Then she nodded once, lightly, just enough. Bowie turned back to Tyson and said, "Here, with Grandma." Tyson nodded, stood up, and no one inside the shelter knew that when he turned his back and walked out, he paused for 1 second in the doorway and took one deep breath before going on, because Bowie's answer was the answer Tyson himself had wanted to say 20 years earlier and had never been able to. The following week, Tyson called a family lawyer, not Orson Webb because Orson had vanished, but a new man. One Tyson paid to do what was right instead of what was wrong, and he began the process of temporary guardianship for Maggie, legally, through the Suffolk County Court, with a judge's signature and proper paperwork, because Tyson Aldridge understood that in the underworld, a man's word is law, but in the real world, paperwork is what keeps a child safe. Earl learned the news that morning when he came to the shelter and saw Bowie tidying his room, straightening the mattress, sweeping the floor, placing a smooth round stone he had picked up at the harbor on the corner of the window ledge as the first decoration in the first room that truly belonged to him. Earl said nothing. He took off his knit cap, opened his toolbox, and began measuring a piece of oak he had saved from the week before because he had known it would be used for something. He carved a small bookshelf, 2 shelves, just enough to hang on the wall beside where Bowie slept. And through all 3 hours of carving, his hands didn't tremble once. Bowie stood beside him and watched him work, and when Earl finished hanging the shelf on the wall, the boy placed on it the only book he owned, a thin paperback Maggie had bought for him at the used bookstore on the corner with her savings, and the bookshelf looked full, even with only 1 book. Earl looked at his hands, opened them, closed them, opened them again, and they weren't shaking, and he understood something the doctors had never told him, that hands stop trembling when they know they are making something that matters. 6 months later, the scrapyard at South Boston Harbor was no longer a scrapyard at all. The shelter Maggie had built from old doors and rusted tin was now the center of a small community the harbor people called the Aldridge House, not because Tyson had named it that, but because people began calling it that on their own, and the name simply stayed. Tyson used his influence to speed zoning and building permits through Boston City Hall, not with envelopes slipped under tables the way things were done before, but with a good lawyer and a clean file, because he was beginning to understand that some things built on legal paperwork stand firmer than things built on fear. Maggie cooked every day in the brick kitchen she had built, from bricks gathered in the scrapyard, and the pot of bean soup in the copper pot never went cold. And dock workers, sailors, truck drivers, the same people who 6 months earlier had called her the scrapyard old woman, now stopped by every evening to eat a hot bowl and sit in the courtyard where Earl had added a roof of reclaimed wood. Earl taught woodworking to children from Southie every Saturday afternoon, 5 or 6 of them sitting around his oak toolbox learning how to measure, cut, and carve, and Earl told them the same sentence every class: measure twice and cut once, and his hands didn't shake when he held the chisel and showed them how to press at the right angle. Bowie went back to school at a public school near the harbor, carrying a lunchbox Maggie packed for him every morning from 5 o'clock, and every afternoon he came back to the shelter and did his homework at the wooden desk Earl had built for him, beside the 2-shelf bookcase that now held 7 books. The underground cellar beneath the shelter became major news when a history professor from Harvard University came down to survey it, measuring every brick, photographing the arches and the herringbone pattern, and confirming that it was part of a bootleg liquor cellar system from Prohibition in the 1920s, a historical legacy of the city of Boston that until then had existed only in legend and in the stories told by old harbormen. The cellar was entered into the city's historic preservation register, and the preservation signing ceremony took place at City Hall with Maggie present, the woman whom 6 months earlier a district official had called a homeless woman in an internal report, and that same official now sat at the signing table, pen in hand, signing his name, and didn't dare look her in the eye even once. Tyson used the ledger not for revenge, but for restructuring. He cut away every dirty section of the empire, every illegal route, every underground connection the ledger exposed, and kept the lawful logistics side of Aldridge Maritime, turning it from a cover into a real entity, from a money laundering company into a real cargo shipping company, operating in Boston Harbor. It wasn't because he had suddenly become a good man. Tyson Aldridge wasn't a good man, and he knew it, but because he understood something his father had spent a lifetime building and never managed to put fully into words. An empire built on fear can be stolen by anyone, but an empire built on loyalty can't be destroyed. In a small coastal town in Maine, 4 hours from Boston by car, Priscilla lived in a rented 1-bedroom apartment, and the $14,000 grew smaller day by day, and no one called, no one came, and every morning she woke and looked out at the gray sea, with no one asking if she was all right, exactly the way she had never once asked Bowie if he was all right when he fell on the stairs of the Back Bay mansion. On Christmas night that year, the Aldridge house was lit up for the first time. Earl hung strings of lights he had found at the Southie flea market along the reclaimed wooden awning, and their warm yellow glow fell across the courtyard, where Maggie had set a long table made by laying 3 wooden doors across brick supports. Enough room for 20 people to sit. The harbor people came one by one: dock workers, sailors, drivers, the old man who lived in the van, the woman who sold things on the corner, the children who learned woodworking with Earl every Saturday afternoon. And they brought bottles of soda, tins of cookies, bags of candy, the small things they had, and set them on the table beside the steaming pot of bean soup. Bowie sat next to Earl, wearing the new coat Maggie had bought him, with the money the harbor people had collected and given her for the holiday, money she hadn't kept for herself. And the boy was smiling, the kind of smile that 6 months earlier no one would have believed could ever appear, on the thin face with dark circles under the eyes that had stood at the gap in the iron fence, looking into the scrapyard. Earl sat beside Bowie, his gray knit cap still on his head, his oak toolbox resting at the foot of his chair because he never went anywhere without it, and he smiled at the boy with the smile of a man who had found a reason to wake up tomorrow. Then Tyson arrived. No 3-piece suit, no black car, no bodyguards, no one opening the door for him. He walked in through the gap in the iron fence that Maggie had never patched because she said every door is a door, wearing a black sweater, his hands in his pockets, stepping into the courtyard through laughter and yellow light, and he sat down beside his mother on the wooden chair Earl had built, especially for her. Except tonight, she had placed one more seat beside it, without telling anyone who it was for. Maggie stood up, went into the kitchen, and brought out the copper pot, the same pot her mother had given her on her wedding day. The same pot she had carried with her the night she left the Back Bay mansion at 4 a.m, the same pot she had used to cook the first bowl of soup for Bowie, the bowl of soup Tyson had eaten for the first time in 15 years. The same pot that had made hundreds of bowls of soup for people no one else cooked for. She ladled soup for each person, one bowl after another. And when she set a bowl in front of Tyson, he looked at the soup, looked at the copper pot, then looked down at the blackened silver ring on the ring finger of his right hand. He turned the ring once, slowly, with his thumb, and he didn't need to turn it over to read the inside because he had memorized every word carved there from the night he knelt at the bottom of the cellar. Maggie Aldridge slept every night in the shelter she had built with her own hands, the copper pot on the kitchen shelf beside her bed, and the words engraved on the ring her son wore every day weren't anyone's promise, weren't comfort, weren't some saying hung on a wall, but the exact description of who she was. For those who don't fold, for those who don't collapse, this story isn't about mafia or power or money, but about a 65-year-old woman who walked out the back door with a suitcase and decided that she wouldn't collapse. And from that decision, everything changed. Not only for her, but for everyone around her. Because when one person chooses to rise instead of lie down, the light from that person becomes a path for others still searching for a reason to stand. The lesson Maggie left behind doesn't live in the ledger or in the underground cellar, but in the copper pot. That sometimes all you need to rebuild a life is your own two hands, patience, and the courage to say no when the whole world wants you to bow your head. What do you think of Tyson's decision to spare Priscilla instead of taking revenge? And from 0 to 10, how would you rate the moment the most powerful boss in Boston knelt at the bottom of the wine cellar and pressed his forehead to his mother's cracked hands? And what does this story make you think of in your own real life? We want to hear what you feel from deep in your heart, so please share in the comments below. Every story and every experience you carry is precious, and we read every line. If this story touched you, please hit like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so that every day there'll be a new story waiting for you. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.